United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, at the weekend in a report stressed that religious freedoms were constantly being trampled upon in Nigeria. USCIRF said the report provided an update on continuing systematic and ongoing restrictions on freedom of religion or belief in Nigeria. It said several states in Nigeria are currently enforcing blasphemy laws to persecute members of faith-based groups, including Christians, Muslims, and secular humanists. In the 2024 annual report, USCIRF said, and I quote, "The government also continues to tolerate egregious violence against religious groups by non-state actors such as the Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, JAS, Boko Haram, and other extremist groups. This violence affects large numbers of Christians and Muslims in several states across Nigeria and targets both religious sites and individuals from religious communities," end of quote. USCIRF recommended that the U.S. Department of State should designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern for engaging in what it said was a systematic, ongoing, and egregious violation of religious freedom. All right, Vimbai, religious freedom on the table this morning as we open up the week. This is a report, an annual report, and just it details a few concerns, in fact, country of particular concern. Your take on the story?
You know, the first thing I did, Ayo, is I looked at the other countries, that have also been categorized as countries of particular concern. They include Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, China, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. So the fact that Nigeria has been put in this group is of massive, massive concern. When you go through the report, you see there's a lot of reference to what's happening with regards to extremism in the north, with groups like Boko Haram, but there's also an intertwining of the activities of Fulani bandits. So I think the report failed to do two things, which is to separate those who are using religion, hiding behind religion as a cover to execute extremism and criminality, and religion being used for discriminatory purposes. However, having said that, the main point is that this is out in the open. The statistics are there. They've done their research. Now, what are we doing to continue to create an atmosphere of tolerance in Nigeria? It all starts with little pockets of this and that. If you look at how things exploded in the United Kingdom, it's sentiment that brews in pockets and we ignore and we turn our face away from, and we behave in a hypocritical way, especially as people who love faith and who love religion in this country. But there's no religion that preaches hate. So it's very important for each one of us in every corner of this country to take a look back at into ourselves, do some introspection. Look at the North. The report focused on arrests based off of blasphemy and the implementation of Sharia law. Now, we have to ask ourselves, where are we going? Where are we actually going? You look at the Muslim ticket that came into governance with this administration, and a lot of people might say, well, in a country that is dominated by both Christian and Muslims, that this was a show of a level of tolerance, because something like that may not happen in a place that's known to be highly extremist. However, the main message still comes down to tolerance, because if we're not careful, there is a bigger crisis brewing. Dare I say the crisis has already erupted.
Yeah. All right.
Okay,
fine.
so a couple of things. Number one, we need to set things apart. It is not today we've been having conversation and reports as regards the role religion is playing in most parts of the country as regards division and how the government has been looking away. In the time of President Muhammadu Buhari, Reverend Father Martin Kuka wrote extensive letters to everybody that cared to listen, that there was a lot of religious intolerance being perpetrated across board. But today, nothing has been done. And the report was explicit, clear, when it cited cases of 2-3 people out there in the north that have been held for case of religious intolerance and the high-handedness as regards it. Of course, it even cited the case of Rhoda. Remember the case of Rhoda, that we had to protest and we had to clamor until she was granted the bail, but those charges still hang over her.
Still there.
Blasphemy is firm in a country where the Constitution is supposed to be the ground norm. The Constitution says we must have no appreciation for any state religion. But today, you have a country that pays 90 billion to subsidize religious travel. So it's slanted, it's tilted. And that's why a lot of people start to look otherwise. We in Nigeria remember the riots that heralded the bringing about the Sharia laws in the early 2000s in this country, where this country was polarized across the flanks. Finally, we had those Sharia laws, which this report also talks about, amputation and things like that. These things, the laws put in there, also negates the ground norm. And there are many times we've had dichotomy. You remember the case of the man arrested, and there was a dichotomy between the constitution, the ground norm, and the Sharia code that said he should be stoned. So we have not sorted out all of that. You know, because when people talk about religion and balancing, what is fair for someone should also be fair for the other. But we are not seeing the southern states being run by a couple of Christian laws, but we're seeing it otherwise. And we're seeing challenges across board. And that's what this report is talking about. And I understand, yes, that the report might not have gotten the nuance right by saying groups like Boko Haram, because that is clear banditry. Those are criminals.
Yeah, even the Fulani.
Those are criminals. And there should be some distinction and not put religion into it. But from the get-go, religion has always been in the conversation. Everything is divided along religious lines, even with governmental quotas. So how can we dial back on this? I think the very first way to dial back on this is to respect the Constitution by reminding ourselves that Nigeria is not a state that has any state religion. So you trying to favor one over the other definitely is not going to work. And also, perpetrators of this injustice must be brought to book. We caught on video somebody saying we're part of those that burnt that lady because she professed her faith in a WhatsApp group. Deborah, till today, nothing has been done. The case of Eunice Olawale is there. Yeah. She was preaching across the street. She was hurt. Yeah. She was killed. Till today, nothing has been done. And that's the country we live in. Yeah. So when reports come out like this, they are indicative of our society in general.
Absolutely. So this commission is a commission that releases annual reports on religious freedom across the world. It is supported by the US Congress, so it's important to also understand the context and some biases that might be there in terms of the outcome of that report. But in terms of the detail of the report, I don't think a lot of people would argue with the outcome in terms of is there a case or a rising case of religious intolerance in Nigeria? Absolutely. We see it play out. And oftentimes two things are used as weapons when it suits, powers or interests. Number one is religion, and number two is ethnicity. We've seen the rise of that in recent years. But I must also balance that by saying that across the world, reports also show that religious intolerance has heightened, has increased, and was exacerbated during COVID times. So it's not just in Nigeria, but this is a reality that we must begin to look at so that we're able to avoid certain challenges on our hands. A big question there, especially as you rightly touched on, Rufai, is the Constitution versus religious laws or religious beliefs. I say this because in certain parts, I think about 12 countries were cited in this report as having adopted Sharia law, and how that is at variance in some instances with the Constitution of Nigeria. It's also important that Nigeria as a nation is meant to be a secular state, whereby no one religion dominates. Not Christianity, not Islam, not humanism, not traditional worship, not even people with no faith. Everyone ought to have religious freedom. However, it's important to note the peculiarity of a Christian moving to the north, for instance, and having to abide by Sharia laws, even if they don't believe in it. So these are some of the conversations we must begin to have. The truth is that once we talk about, religious intolerance, even the conversation in itself can become contentious. There are certain areas they don't want you to touch. There are certain areas you don't want you to go near. And so the first thing I must say is that we need to rethink, as difficult as it is, whether Sharia law is anti our constitution or should exist in a secular state. Even the political over we talk about, look at where religious freedom also hampers the freedom of movement as guaranteed by the Constitution. So a number of things that we need to talk about. But is Nigeria ready to have that conversation? That's the first question I'll be asking this morning. Are we ready?
Well, you know what, we're going to have those difficult conversations. I think it's time to have those difficult conversations. But for now, let's take a look at some stories from around the globe, where in his first interview since dropping out of the presidential race, US President Joe Biden has told broadcaster CBS that he made the decision in order to maintain democracy in the United States. Biden said, and I quote, "The polls we had showed that it was a neck-and-neck race. Would have been down to the wire. But what happened was a number of my Democratic colleagues in the House and Senate thought that I was going to hurt them in the races," end quote. Biden also stressed that besides what the polls showed him, the main reason behind his decision was also to maintain democracy and defeat Trump, in reference to former President Donald Trump, who's once again the Republican Party's presidential candidate.
Look, the polls we had showed that it was a neck-and-neck race, would have been down to the wire. But what happened was a number of my Democratic colleagues in the House and Senate thought that I was going to hurt them in the races. And I was concerned if I stayed in the race, that would be the topic. You'd be interviewing me about why did Nancy Pelosi say, why did someone, and I thought it'd be a real distraction. If Trump wins, no, I'm not confident at all. I mean, if Trump loses, I'm not confident at all. He means what he says. We don't take him seriously. He means it. All the stuff about if we lose, there'll be a bloodbath. Have to be a stolen election. Look what they're trying to do now in the local election districts where people count the votes. They're putting people in place in states that they're going to count the votes, right? You can't love your country only when you win.
All right, well, it's great to hear from the president. First time since, of course, he dropped off of the ticket. And a lot of bombshells dropped there, although, you know, there was a lot of speculation already surrounding how he came to be removed from the ticket. We saw what happened at the very last minute, where it was like he kept pushing forward, but it seemed people in the Democratic Party worked to ensure that the race ultimately would be saved. You know, a lot of criticism, of course, from the Republican side. You know, I always bring the comments from that side, which are that they're saying that, well, the Democrat Party seems to be undemocratic. They're saying that what happened was a coup. Not my words, by the way. I'm just relaying their sentiments. So what are your guys' thoughts on how Joe Biden was relieved of his duties for running as president for another term, and what that spells for the power dynamics in the Democrat Party?
So truth has to be said. The Republicans can say anything they want to say. If it was not within the law, the Democratic Party would not be able to do what they have done. And if you go back historically, in the 40s, they too did something like that. I mean, they had two candidates that they couldn't agree on the primaries, I think in the 1940 elections. So they had to bring in a third outlier called Wendell Willkie to participate in the elections, and he was the front runner of the Republican Party. I mean, we've seen that many times happen. So that's about the law, because it's also our duty to correct notions and norms. If it was against the law, they would have gone to court as regards it, and they would have challenged the court. So it was just talk. There's a difference. We bring out facts. We don't talk sentiments. So that was sentiment. Secondly, Biden did say it very strongly. And when the facts were staring at him in the face, that even in the areas he thought that were good areas for him, he was already losing. That's when he made that decision. It was a tough decision, yes. But he had to be a party man, because the question is, in the end, they wanted to win elections. There was no way Biden was going to win the elections there. He also talked about many other things. He talked about, you know, the Israeli conflict and all of that, which is another very sore point, because people were campaigning were giving a hard time against that they did not have peace in that region, Palestinian and all of that, the Gaza conflict and all of that. In fact, there's going to be a resumption of talks, you know, soon as regards it. And he's put a deal on the table which Netanyahu has not been able to take. Then he talked about, you know, geopolitics and the future of America in general. I mean, one thing is certain. Biden might have had his own rough patch, but he will go down as an American president, that you easily remember. He's a man that keeps reinventing himself when you kick him off. If you remember the first time he tried running for presidency, he had a big scandal. You remember the scandal? Where he quoted something from Neil Kinnock and didn't attribute it to Neil Kinnock. A lot of people in the 80s then said his career was over. He will never become president again. He did it many years down the line, and he was successful at this. He was going, you know, to the doldrums very soon if he had continued the campaign, but the allowed voice of reason prevailed. And now the Democratic Party has a lot of energy with Tim Walz and all of that. So the campaign is back on track. And if you see the reports that are coming out recently, Kamala Harris is doing well, leading Trump in most of the battleground states now. But the truth is, it's still within the margin of error. So when something is within the margin of error, I still pretty much say it's neck and neck. So let's see how this race pans out. And we're going to the next week where the Democratic Party will be having their own convention. And let's see how it pans out.
All right, so President Biden, in his first appearance, the first question for a number of people is, has he finally spoken to Nancy Pelosi? I don't know if you responded to that, but on a very serious note, with regards to his claims, or he's saying that he's unsure of the maintenance of democracy in the event that Trump loses, and it's looking, like a likely prospect, because in the past, when he was still in the race, it seemed like it was almost a clear win for Trump. It didn't seem like there was much of a competition for him. But now, surprisingly, Kamala Harris coming into the race has changed the game. And we're seeing different polls across the country in favor of her lead. However, let me now put it with regards to times when former President Trump had been asked questions around what would happen if he didn't win. And he said, well, he didn't want to, he didn't answer the question. He was a bit evasive. And he said, no, he was going to win if things were fair. In fact, he already questioned the fairness of the election if he did not win. That's a red flag. He was also asked about, he's tried to push it to his supporters in the same way the invasion of Capitol was also his people who came out thinking it was unfair. His body language, his conversation, unfortunately, could almost give credence to what President Joe Biden, the concerns that President Joe Biden raised in that particular interview. And so it's quite valid, not because he said it as an opposition, but because of former President Trump's response himself when he's been asked as to whether he would accept the result in the event that he lost the election. That's a big concern. In fact, he did say that it might spell the end of democracy in in America, in the US, if he doesn't win. That's a big statement right there. It might seem like an innocent, campaign, but we've seen how words, conversations, rhetorics by politicians can affect their support base and how they can then respond very violently. In fact, it's been asked pointedly whether or not he thinks that there'll be violence if we didn't win. So these are things of concern, and maybe in response, rather than insulting President Joe Biden in his response, let him come out and speak to his base that he believes in the sanctity of democracy in America, and that irrespective of what happens, he would accept the result and he would be a good sportsman about it. I think that's a message he needs to start and bring it out to his people.
I absolutely agree with you, and I don't think we can afford to have another January 6th insurrection. So, let everybody play by the rules. Now, in our next story, Hamas has said that
Trump will do it if he has a chance again.
Rufai, let's go to the Middle East, where Hamas has said that any resumption of ceasefire talks about the conflict in Gaza should be based on previous plans rather than holding new rounds of negotiations. Well, last week, international mediators from Qatar, Egypt, and the US urged Israel and Hamas to attend negotiations on a ceasefire and hostage release deal on the 15th of August. Israel responded on Thursday, saying it would send a team of negotiators to take part in the meeting. Negotiations faltered last month after new terms were introduced to the framework presented by US President Joe Biden in May. On Monday, the leaders of the UK, France, and Germany issued a joint call for talks to resume, saying there can be no further delay. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz echoed the mediators' call for ceasefire talks to resume in a joint statement. Now, in a statement about the ceasefire talks, Hamas responded to pressure from mediators by calling for a plan to be drawn up based on Mr. Biden's vision for May, essentially agreeing to resume negotiations from the point where they stopped rather than on any new initiative. So the stalemate on the current Gaza crisis continues. And we're still seeing Israel maintaining a bullish position. And Israel, I know, has issued a statement saying that they are well within their rights. This is an act of self-defense. So these ceasefire negotiations, continue to sort of just stalemate. Rufai, what do you think is going to move the pedal on this?
Netanyahu. That's the reason for all the problem. Netanyahu. Go and check. The last time Bibi was here, he brought a lot of problems. Bibi brought another problem. Truth has to be said. Let's not forget, let's not divorce all of this from the initial local challenges Bibi had been facing in this country. The fact that he had a long, protracted battle with the people as regards how to reform the judiciary to his own favor. He was not popular. Then the war came. Then he got some level of push. And he will look for ways to keep his own. It is stubbornness that is keeping this on. Even the Americans, that we know they are hypocritical in this war because they support Israel, give them all the armament and all of that, are saying that there's a time to ceasefire. But Bibi has always been the factor. Bibi's hard-headedness. I mean, you've seen some people leave the cabinet and they're saying we can't deal with this any longer. I mean, there must be a stop to all of this. Normally, when you have uprisings like this, like we normally have in that area, after 1 or 2, 3 months, it subsides. You have a ceasefire, they call for a truce, and they reset. But guess what? Bibi has held this long enough, so he's been 1 year in power. So the sticking point, even if you call President Macron and everybody, is always going to be Bibi Netanyahu. And now he's hard-headed about taking that deal Biden's putting on the table, because Biden had announced prior to this time that they were going to have a deal. So the sticking point in all of this is Bibi Netanyahu.
All right. Well, I do think there are two people who ought to take responsibility. Yes, I agree that Netanyahu has a huge role to play in terms of the ceasefire deal, which has been ongoing. And unfortunately, with the latest killing killing of the Hamas leader, it has then, a number of people asked if that would be stalled, if the ceasefire conversations be stalled. But it's good to see now that they're still willing to proceed or progress with it. But the only conversation that's happening is that the new Hamas leader is said to be the mastermind of the attacks in October. And so a number of people thought that it would be stalled. And also the talks about a retaliation by Hamas after the killing of their leader, and the fact that they also believe that America is culpable as a result of their support for Israel. So there are a number of conversations there. I think the good news is that the table is still open. The negotiation table for a ceasefire is still open. They've tried to come up with a deal which was rejected, with both parties saying that it doesn't represent the interest of what they'd asked for initially. Of course, big on the negotiation table of talks about ceasefire is the release of hostages, and a few other things. So let's see what will change, or whether or not Israel is willing to move. Of course, the conversation and the attention has been on Israel, that they have been quite high-handed in terms of their response to the attacks, the initial attacks by Hamas. And so that Netanyahu has to soft pedal in order to get some peace in the Middle East. I don't know how soon this will happen, but it has to happen very soon. And I believe that the U.S. has a huge role to play. They have to put pressure on Netanyahu. They have to put pressure on Israel. Yes, they've always been allies, but in the interest of peace in the Middle East, they must begin to tell some home truths to Netanyahu.